Something is shifting, and most Americans aren't being told the full story. US bases in Qatar, some of the most strategically critical military positions the United States holds in the entire Middle East, came under direct Iranian missile assault. And here is what demands your attention. There was no retaliation. The most powerful military apparatus in human history absorbed that strike and stood down. Now, you have to ask yourself, why? Because in geopolitics, what a government chooses not to do tells you far more about real power dynamics than what it actually does. This is not weakness being reported on your evening news. This is calculation. This is the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental has changed in the balance of power across that region, and Washington knows it. The rules that governed American military dominance for decades are being renegotiated, not at a table, but on the ground, through missiles, through silence, and through the slow, undeniable restructuring of who holds leverage in a world that is no longer unipolar. Let us go back and think carefully about what we actually know, because the details here matter enormously. And the details are precisely what mainstream American media tends to bury underneath layers of official framing and Pentagon-approved language. What happened in Qatar was not a minor incident. What happened in Qatar was not a provocation from a reckless actor lashing out without consequence. What happened was a deliberate, calculated military strike against installations where American soldiers live, work, and operate. And the United States government, with all of its aircraft carriers, all of its fighter jets, all of its special operations forces, and all of its nuclear capability, decided not to shoot back. That decision, that single strategic choice, is what we need to spend our time understanding today, because it carries consequences that will reshape this part of the world for a generation. Now, most of the conversation you will hear in American media will focus on the immediate tactical question. Was anyone hurt? What was damaged? How did the missiles get through? These are legitimate questions, and they matter, but they are also the kind of questions that keep your attention focused on the surface of events rather than the structure underneath. And it is the structure underneath that actually governs how nations behave, how power is distributed, and how the long arc of geopolitical history bends. So let us talk about structure. Let us talk about what the United States has actually been doing in Qatar, why it has been doing it, and what the presence of those bases really represents in the larger context of American foreign policy in the Middle East over the last several decades. The United States has maintained a significant military presence in Qatar for a long time now. Al Udeid Air Base, which is the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, sits on Qatari soil. It has served as a command and logistics hub for American operations across Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and the broader region. Tens of thousands of American military personnel have rotated through that facility. It is not a symbolic presence, it is a deeply operational one, and it represents an enormous investment of American military infrastructure, diplomatic capital, and strategic commitment. When Iran targeted those facilities, Iran was not throwing rocks at a fence. Iran was sending a missile at the centerpiece of American military projection in the region. That is an entirely different kind of act. And yet, Washington did not respond militarily. Now, some people will tell you this is because the situation was managed diplomatically, that back channels were used, that both sides communicated their intentions ahead of time to avoid escalation. There is probably some truth to that. We know from historical precedent, particularly from what happened in January 2020, when Iran struck Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq in response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani, that Iran has demonstrated a capacity and a willingness to telegraph certain strikes in ways that allow American forces to minimize casualties while still delivering a domestic political message to Iranian audiences. Iran is not an irrational actor. Iran's leadership understands deterrence, understands signaling, and understands the language of escalation management. But here is the thing, even if you accept all of that, even if you grant every bit of that diplomatic backstory, the fundamental political and strategic reality remains unchanged. Iran fired on American bases and America did not fire back. That is the sentence that history will record. Think about what that sentence would have meant in 1990. Think about what it would have meant in 2003. Think about what it would have meant in any year during the period of unquestioned American military dominance in the post-Cold War era. The answer, of course, is that it would have been essentially unthinkable. The entire architecture of American deterrence in the Middle East was built on the assumption, and it was a credible assumption for a very long time, that any direct military strike on American personnel or American installations would be met with overwhelming, immediate, and devastating force. That assumption was the foundation of American power projection. It was the thing that kept adversaries calculating very carefully before they acted. And now that assumption has been tested, and the test has produced a result that is different from what that entire architecture predicted. So, what changed? Because something clearly changed, and we owe it to ourselves as citizens, as people trying to understand the world our children will inherit, to think seriously about what that something is. And I want to suggest that it is not one thing. It is a convergence of several structural developments that have been building for years and that have now reached a point where their combined weight is bending the arc of American foreign policy in ways that the country has not fully reckoned with publicly. The first of these developments is the simple and unavoidable reality of military exhaustion. The United States has been at war continuously since 2001. That is more than 2 decades of sustained military engagement. The human cost has been staggering. Thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of civilian lives across the region. The financial cost has been equally staggering. Estimates for the total cost of the post-September 11th wars, when you include long-term veteran care, interest on debt, and indirect economic impacts, run into the trillions of dollars. And what did those expenditures produce? In Afghanistan, the Taliban returned to power within weeks of the American withdrawal, erasing 2 decades of stated objectives almost overnight. In Iraq, the country remains deeply unstable. Iranian influence in Baghdad is arguably greater today than it was before the American invasion, and the Islamic State, which emerged directly from the chaos that the invasion created, required another massive military campaign to suppress. The American public, across party lines, is deeply skeptical of further military adventurism in the Middle East. Any president who ordered a major military strike on Iran today would face enormous domestic political resistance, not just from the left, but from a significant portion of the right as well, which has developed its own strand of skepticism about foreign intervention. The second development is the changing economic calculus of the region. For most of the post-World War II era, American strategic interest in the Middle East was organized overwhelmingly around oil. The security of oil supply routes, the stability of oil-producing states friendly to Washington, the prevention of any hostile power from gaining control over the region's energy resources. These were the organizing principles of American Middle East policy. They justified the bases, the arms sales, the support for authoritarian governments, and yes, the wars. But the American relationship with fossil fuel imports has changed significantly over the last 15 years. The shale revolution transformed the United States into a major oil and gas producer. American dependence on Middle Eastern oil is simply not what it was in 1973 or even in 2003. That does not mean American strategic interest in the region has evaporated. It has not. But it does mean that the economic urgency that once made almost any cost seem acceptable in the defense of regional stability has diminished, and that diminishment is reflected slowly and imperfectly in political calculations in Washington. The third development, and this one is perhaps the most structurally significant of all, is the rise of a genuinely multipolar world. For roughly 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, The United States operated in a world where there was no serious peer competitor. American military power was unchallengeable. American economic power was dominant. American soft power, the ability to set the terms of international discourse, to define what counted as legitimate and illegitimate behavior in the international system, was at its historic peak. That era is over. China has emerged as a genuine great power with global economic reach and rapidly growing military capability. Russia, despite its severe problems, has demonstrated that it retains the capacity and the will to use military force to reshape political outcomes in its near abroad, and that the Western response to that use of force has real limits. Iran itself has developed a regional network of allied and proxy forces in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, that gives it a capacity for asymmetric power projection that it simply did not possess 20 years ago. The world that American foreign policy was designed to manage has fundamentally changed, and American foreign policy is struggling visibly and painfully to adapt to that change. Now, what does all of this mean for the specific situation in Qatar? It means that when the Biden administration or any American administration today looks at the question of how to respond to an Iranian strike on American bases, it is not looking at that question in a vacuum. It is looking at it in the context of all of these structural pressures simultaneously. It is calculating what a military response would cost in terms of escalation risk, given that Iran now has allies and proxies across the region who could open multiple fronts simultaneously. It is calculating what a military response would cost in terms of domestic political capital, given the deep war weariness of the American public. It is calculating what a military response would cost in terms of economic disruption, given that a broader conflict in the Persian Gulf would have severe implications for global energy markets and a global economy that is already under stress. And it is calculating all of this against the backdrop of a multipolar world in which China and Russia would likely use any prolonged American military engagement in the Middle East to advance their own interests elsewhere. When you add all of that up, the decision not to retaliate militarily, whatever its costs in terms of deterrence credibility, starts to look less like weakness and more like a very cold-eyed assessment of constrained options. But here is where I think we need to be honest with ourselves, because intellectual honesty is the only thing that actually helps us understand the world clearly. The decision not to retaliate does carry real costs, and those costs are going to compound over time. Deterrence is not an abstract concept. It is a system of beliefs and expectations maintained by consistent behavior. Every time a line is drawn and not enforced, every time a red line fades without consequence, the system of deterrence weakens. Other actors in the region and around the world are watching what happened in Qatar very carefully. They are updating their models of what the United States will and will not do. And some of them are going to draw conclusions that lead them to test those limits further. That is not speculation. That is how great power competition has worked throughout history. Perceived weakness, whether real or constructed, invites probing. And probing, if not checked, escalates. The Israelis are watching this very closely. The Gulf states are watching this very closely. Saudi Arabia, which has been engaged in its own complex dance of realignment, reaching out to China, engaging in diplomatic normalization with Iran, brokered by Beijing, is reading these signals carefully and adjusting its own calculations accordingly. The Abraham Accords, which represented a significant American diplomatic achievement in reshaping the regional order, are now operating in a context where American security guarantees carry somewhat less automatic weight than they did when those agreements were signed. This does not mean those agreements collapse. It does mean that the countries that signed them are hedging their bets more actively, maintaining relationships with multiple great powers simultaneously and reducing their dependence on any single patron. That is rational behavior for smaller states in a multipolar world. But it also represents a structural erosion of American influence in a region where that influence was once nearly total. Let us also talk about Iran's strategic position for a moment, because it is important to understand what Iran thinks it achieved by striking those bases and why Iranian leadership believed the benefits of that action outweighed the risks. Iran has been living under crushing American economic sanctions for decades. The sanctions have caused real suffering for ordinary Iranian people. They have also failed repeatedly and completely to achieve their stated political objective, which was to compel Iran to abandon its nuclear program and its regional influence operations. Iran today has more advanced nuclear enrichment capabilities than it did before the sanctions began. Iran today has a more extensive and capable network of regional proxies than it did before the sanctions began. The sanctions have not broken Iran. What they have done is convince Iranian leadership that the United States is implacably hostile to the Islamic Republic's existence, and that the only rational response to that hostility is to develop enough deterrent capability, enough capacity to impose costs on American interests that Washington eventually concludes the price of confrontation is too high. Striking American bases in Qatar and watching Washington choose not to retaliate validates that strategic calculation in a very direct and powerful way. It tells Iranian leadership that their investment in missile capability, in regional proxies, in asymmetric deterrence has produced real results. It tells them that the equation has shifted, and that lesson once learned does not get unlearned. There is also a domestic political dimension to Iranian behavior that Americans rarely think about carefully enough, because we tend to project our own political frameworks onto other societies in ways that distort our understanding. Iranian leadership operates within a domestic political context that has its own pressures, its own factions, its own constituencies. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a monolithic institution operating in perfect alignment with every aspect of government policy. There are hardliners who believe maximum pressure on American interests is always the correct posture. There are more pragmatic elements who are looking for off-ramps that allow Iran to reintegrate into the global economy without sacrificing core security interests. What happens on the international stage feeds back into those internal debates. A strike that goes unanswered strengthens the hand of those who argue that pressure works, that steadfastness produces results, that Iran does not need to make significant concessions to achieve its fundamental security objectives. This matters for the future trajectory of Iranian foreign policy in ways that go well beyond the immediate incident. And now let us pull all the way back and look at this from the largest possible frame, because I think that is ultimately what this moment demands of us. We are living through a transition in the structure of the international system. The unipolar moment, that period of American dominance that followed the end of the Cold War, is ending. It is not ending because America has become weak in any absolute sense. The United States still has the world's most powerful military, the world's largest economy, and enormous reservoirs of soft power and institutional influence. But relative power is what matters in international politics, and relative to the world of 1995 or even 2005, American power is more constrained, more contested, and more expensive to exercise than it was. The rise of China, the resilience of Russia, the development of regional powers like Iran, India, Turkey, and Brazil, all of this adds up to a world in which no single actor can simply dictate outcomes the way the United States could in the immediate post-Cold War period. This transition is deeply uncomfortable for Americans to reckon with, because it runs against a national narrative that has been built up over decades. The narrative of American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is a uniquely virtuous and capable nation with both the right and the responsibility to shape the international order, is not just a political talking point. It is a deeply held cultural belief that shapes how Americans understand their place in the world and what they expect from their government. When events like what happened in Qatar puncture that narrative, the psychological and political response tends to be either denial or anger. And neither of those responses is particularly useful for actually understanding what is happening and thinking clearly about what to do about it. What is useful is exactly what we have been trying to do in this conversation, looking at the facts clearly, following the structural logic of the situation wherever it leads, and resisting the temptation to substitute emotional reaction for analysis. What happened in Qatar is a data point, an important one, in a much larger story about the redistribution of power in the international system. That story is going to continue unfolding regardless of what any of us think or feel about it. The question is whether the United States, its government, its political class, and its citizens will develop the capacity to understand that story clearly enough to navigate it wisely. The alternative, which is to continue operating on the assumptions of a unipolar world that no longer exists, is a path toward miscalculation, toward unnecessary conflict, and toward outcomes that serve nobody's interests, least of all the interests of ordinary American people who have already paid an enormous price for the foreign policy choices of the last quarter century. This is the conversation that America needs to be having, not the conversation about whether to feel outraged that Iran struck American bases, though that outrage is understandable and not entirely misplaced. Not the conversation about which political party is more to blame for American weakness, though that conversation will certainly happen and will generate enormous amounts of heat and very little light. The conversation America needs to be having is about what kind of role is actually sustainable for the United States in a world that is genuinely multipolar, what interests are truly vital and worth defending at great cost, and what interests have been defined as vital largely by habit, institutional inertia, and the lobbying power of defense contractors and regional allies with their own agendas. Those are hard questions. They do not have easy answers, but they are the questions that the situation demands. And the fact that American political culture is currently almost entirely incapable of having them seriously is itself one of the most important structural problems that the country faces as it navigates this transition. Qatar is a symptom. The disease is the gap between the world as it is and the world as American political culture insists on believing it to be. And until that gap is honestly confronted, the symptoms are only going to multiply.